about the pitfalls. And the pitfalls or whatever of awakening embodiment, I talk about this almost every time I give a retreat because I don't know, because I like to bust myths. I'm kind of a nonconformist, I think, a little bit. And I like to point things out, and I also like to tell them myself. And so this is a good way to talk about my own experience. So to talk about the pitfalls, like some teachers will talk about it in an abstract way, as if like, this may happen to you, or this may happen to you. What I'm going to say is, this is what happened to me. And I've seen it happen to other people. It may or may not happen to you. And just, because that's all I can really count on is my own experience. I can't count on whether knowing this is going to happen to you. I don't know. I can only share my own experience. So everything I hope that I share comes from that. So I wrote like just a few things just to keep me on track around this, like because there's the before, in a way, the during, and the after. And when I say that, it's not really like that. Those are just dualistic ideas. The before meaning is like when you first come to these kinds of teachings and you get drawn to them for whatever reason. And then some of the pitfalls that might happen along the way as you get drawn into them. And a few that I wrote down, this is something that happened for me, was that I didn't understand like what the seeking was all about. It's like the bug of seeking grabbed a hold of me really, really hard. And it just almost like you don't have a choice. You have to wake up, that kind of thing. And it wasn't like, well, should I wake up or should I go do that? It was like just absolutely single focused about it. And in probably an addictive way, actually. In some ways, I think that the addictions that I was turning towards with drugs and alcohol got replaced in part by the idea of seeking awakening in the future. It's like either heroin or painkillers in the future, or maybe awakening, something. Something that's going to make me not have to deal with my human experience, basically. So I think one of the things I bought into was the idea that there was going to be some magical experience, and then once I have that experience, I'm going to live like apparently I think Buddha or Jesus lived, where I never get triggered again and I live in a state of pure bliss all the time, radiating always, light and love and everything. And there's the funny thing is there's elements of truth to all of that, like that those qualities in some sense do show up. But what I want to talk about also is the other qualities, like it's not just the nice and good, profound things, but some of the darker things. And one of the first things that I got really confused on was thinking that awakening or enlightenment was going to happen in the future. And so, teachers would say, you can't find it in the future. One step towards it is actually a step away from it. But still that addictive nature of who I was couldn't hear it at first and was, it's got to be in the future because it's not now. It doesn't feel like it's now. So it must be in the future. So the seeking towards future went on for a while until I realized, okay, hold on, what they're really saying is you have to stop and be present now and see what's arising now and then just deal with that now. And then once I started to realize that, slowly all that attention and energy that I was putting into seeking it in the future got pulled back into actually resting in the moment and then just being with what's here now. So it was like a redirection of the energy. So the energy had been moving towards future because that's what ego does. And instead I sort of somehow harnessed that energy or relaxed it by feeling into it and then coming back more into the present moment and saying, this must be the place from which I have to investigate. Because if I keep thinking that's in the future, I'm not going to realize it. Not only do the teachings tell me that I'm not going to realize it, but I'm seeing that I'm not going to realize it because every step towards it almost just gives like a sense that there's still another step towards it and then another, and then another, and you're never there, and you never get there. And then 30 years later, you're still doing it, thinking that you're going to find it in the future. I owe a lot of gratitude to my addiction to make me realize that it's not going to work that way, because I chased the drug and I chased the alcohol and everything else for so long, thinking that the answer was in the future, the next moment, the next fix, the next something, that I had turned that towards the awakening. In the same way, it's like looking for that enlightenment as the next ultimate fix. But somewhere along the way, again, it dawned on me that's not what they're saying. And even though the ego wants to move towards the future, towards what it thinks is awakening, that energy can be redirected back into resting and being with what's here now. So, and then therefore the energy can relax when you bring it back home. Because when it's moving forward, there's a lot of energy with that. There's anxiety around that. There's a seeking. There's an urgency. And so when you start to examine and look at that story of future on a regular basis every day and just letting it fall down, fall away, you come back, the energy that you're redirecting settles in and integrates into being here and looking from this place. And that was a major turning point for me, is just to recognize that. And so through the years, I met with so many other seekers just like me who would come to me in sessions, and I could feel their movement towards the future. I could feel that momentum in them. And I did my best to develop ways to deconstruct that, because it's a freight train that never reaches its destination. And it just moves like that, like a freight train. So one of the first things I did was invent the boomerang, just to show them that whatever they think enlightenment is in the future, or awakening, or whatever it is, if you boomerang that back, if you ask, what is that mirroring back about me now? What you're going to find is a deficient self. So you're going to find a self that's not good enough, that isn't lovable, that isn't supported, that isn't valid, that isn't connected, that isn't safe or something. And it's that self that is doing the projection towards future with its thinking. See, because it's deficient, the identity is deficient now, so it projects towards future, thinking that somewhere down the road the answer is going to be found, and that is the error right there. That thought is the error, that it's going to happen in the future. So what I told people in the very beginning when I was doing sessions with them was, first of all, this was before the inquiries were developed, is can we just sit and watch just watch that stream of thoughts that come up that tell you that it's something in the future that you're looking for. And we would just sit and watch. So it'd be like, pictures of Ramana would come up. Or, we looked at, like, sometimes the teeth of gurus. Something about the teeth of the guru tells me that there's divinity in that. And then that would fall away. And then, I have this idea of this white light, or just this deep, profound peace. And we sort of just deconstruct what they think enlightenment is. And once it's deconstructed and they can't really find, it's like not a real thing in the future, it's just a concept. It helps them come back again to the present, and then now be here with what's arising now, which is what all the teachings are pointing to. So my job at first was just like, because I was meeting with spiritual seekers, still thinking that there was this awakening that was going to happen in the future, that I had to help deconstruct for them. And again, the first way I did it was just, when I would boomerang it back, and they would say, the reason I'm seeking enlightenment is because I feel not good enough, or because there's this deficient self here. I became singularly focused on showing them that there is no deficient self there. Like, whether that self is not good enough or unsafe or whatever it says it is, it's not really there. And so when you see that the deficient self isn't there, guess what happens to the search for enlightenment? Gone. Because it was a projection of that false self. And another really practical thing I started doing with people, again, just to repeat, because people don't often do this on the path unless they hear this, is that when you start thinking about awakening in the future, you can either ruminate and jump into that and dream about that and get lost into another story, which is really another story of the ego, or you can see it from awareness when it arises and let it be there and just let it fall, no matter what it tells you about how awakening is coming in the future. I mean, literally, no matter how seductive the thought is that arises that tells you that it's going to happen later, just watch it and let it fall. And that comes from my personal experience, because I was telling you about walking the dogs and like thinking if I turn my head real quick, maybe that'll wake me up, or it's crazy ideas like that. And I told you about the story the other night of when I felt I'd had a few really powerful experiences, but I felt like I had not had that oneness experience that we've been talking about, where you feel like, the sensation in your knee is the same as that sound out there. It's like where there's literally no separation. I knew I hadn't had that experience of oneness. And so again, my mind started doing the false thing. It started saying, well, it must be in the future. Even though the earlier experiences had shown me that no, it's here in the now. There was still this story that said, but I haven't reached oneness. And so that story was important to inform me about something about my experience, which was showing me that maybe something hadn't been realized yet that could become realized. But where you get trapped is following the idea that it's going to happen in the future. The air is right there, and I got caught in it. And so for 5 or 6 months, I kept wanting to chase this oneness experience, because I was treating the concept as real and true. I was like buying into the concept. And so then one day, as that thought came up around wanting oneness, instead of buying into and identifying with the concept, I just turned towards it and I looked at it, and it fell away. And then every time it would come back up, I would just look at it and it would fall away. And then that's when that oneness experience happened. Because I stopped buying into the concept of what the ego was telling me, which was, keep chasing, it's going to happen later. See, I deconstructed that false idea, and that brought me to the here and now. And then when I woke up, it was like, in that moment of non-separation, it felt like literally the entire conceptual structure of the world fell away. It's like nothing that humans thought to be true felt true anymore in that moment. Like literally the entire thing was an illusion, clearly seen in that moment. And that's the power of these teachings, is because there are real experiences and real transformations that happen. I mean, this isn't woo-woo stuff, There's some spirituality out there that is woo-woo, but this non-dual realization is an actual shift that does happen. But the one of the before pitfalls is thinking that is following that idea that it's going to happen in the future. So if you can hear that tonight, and every time you think that thought arises that tells you it's going to happen in the future, no matter how profound or seductive that thought is, if you'll just turn towards it and let it fall, it's showing you the present moment. And that's what awakening is. It's the present moment. It's not the present moment plus the belief of the thought and oneness that you're chasing. It's the present moment without that. Without that chase. Without that concept. Does that make sense? Including all the other concepts, enlightenment, awakening. I don't care what profound concept any teacher throws at you. Don't buy into it just because they say it. Challenge it, because if you're not careful, you'll start to believe it, and you'll start to think it's something that you don't have. It'll start to make you feel deficient. But if you challenge the concept and watch it and let it fall away, including frankly every spiritual concept, I don't care how profound it is, what it does is it brings you back to the bare nakedness of the present moment. And that's what all those teachings have been pointing to for thousands of years. So that's why I didn't want to buy into more concepts. I'd had enough of that. This is a deconstruction process of less knowledge, unlearning. More learning just fills the head up with all kinds of ideas, and then it starts to spin back into future and past, you see. So that's one real hang-up I had, was just thinking, oh God, it's coming in the future. And it's a natural thing for all of us to believe, because that's how our ego operates. It says, if there's a good thing coming, it's going to be in the future. It's not here now. And so we naturally say that about enlightenment. But it doesn't work with enlightenment. You can look forward to buying a house, and you can go buy a house in the future. At some point, I guess. You can think about it that way. But awakening, the actual experience of awakening, has to happen only when you drop the idea completely that it's going to happen in the future. People do say that about the inquiries, that I'm using a process that will get me to some clearer place in the future. But it's the same thing. It's that if the energy is directed towards the future, you got to redirect it towards resting in the now. Always redirect that energy. Just because, it happens with enlightenment, and it can happen with the inquiries too. It can happen with anything, that the energy of the ego gets a hold of it and starts trying to push towards future. You have to redirect the energy and hear what we're saying. We're saying the same thing, is that you have to come back and rest at home here in the present moment, and then examine things from here. See what I mean? Now, okay, even having said that, once you start doing that, it's true that you can start to see an unfolding happening. But it's not being measured by the ego so much anymore. Like the ego is falling away, or it's losing its grip, and you're actually seeing transformative changes happening over time, but it's not the ego pushing for that. It's happening as a flow, as a natural unfolding, because you're resting in the moment and dealing with what's coming up in front of you right now. So that's the strange part about it. You have to make the present moment your home for this, first and foremost. If you make your mind the home for it, it's just going to keep pushing you towards the place where awakening is not, which is in the future. Or being clear in the future. See? So you can see why our tools focus on these things of resting as awareness and looking at only what's appearing now. And this is just my experience. It's not the absolute truth. It's just me sharing my experience here. I remember the night, so when we were talking about still before, or how like awakening, at least head awakening, seems to happen, is there really has to be like an investigation of like the bare nakedness of the moment. Like in a sense of, I remember like at some point when you become more and more present and you really, really look at everything that's in this, everything without thought. You start looking more and more without thought at the vivid reality. More and more, when you're living in that, you start to feel the sense of oneness. First of all, you start to feel it first, because your thoughts are not dividing this from that, or calling this a rug and that a Julia or whatever. So you're looking more and more without concepts. And so these concepts are what's making things feel like they're separate. It's like call a chair, therefore it must be its own thing because I called it that. But when you start looking without those words, when you start looking without labels and stories for things, and you start investigating from that place, and you really look at what's here without the mind, that can be an opening, a really big opening to really to the now. I mean, to the now, literally. So that's the thing that I tell people is like, it's not just like taking short moments where you just stop and just watch your breath. You can do that. It's not just resting in the moment and kind of just noticing space. But it's also just noticing everything, experiencing life fully without labels for a while, and spending a lot of time in that. Because that's our home, right? This is our home. This, whatever this is, this present reality. And yet we haven't spent time to really look at it and to really be with it and feel it, directly, be aware of it directly. So spending time with it without going into mind about it is so valuable to the presence part of this thing. And that's what happened to me that night. It's not a formula that I'm giving you, but the night that I had that oneness experience, that's what I was doing. I was literally seeing that everything just bleeds into everything else. Like everything is bleeding into everything else because my mind wasn't thinking. It was just looking. And it just, I more and more felt like there's no division in the universe. And then, as I said, I was petting my dogs that night, and then it was really felt to be true that there is no division. And then that's when all the conceptual structures fell away, and all the laughter and the love came. And I realized that non-dual realization is a quote-unquote real thing, and it shocked me. So I was like, wow, these teachings are actually talking about something that can be realized. So that was the during. I've talked about the before and the during. The after is where so many of the pitfalls seem to happen. Some of the pitfalls happen before in the sense of that people want to, they want to wake up thinking that then if they wake up, somehow all their traumas and their shames and everything are just going to fall away in a one fell swoop. I think that's a pitfall, or at least you have to be careful with that kind of thinking, because I haven't met a lot of people who've had that experience where they didn't do some work on the human issues, and they just had this experience of awakening and never experienced a trauma resurfacing or a little depressive episode or an addiction creeping in. Once the experience of oneness, which has never left me, but at some point it becomes ordinary. At first, the light came on suddenly. So it was like, oh, whoa. And it was very, 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 very shocking and profound. And at the same time, I didn't understand any of it. The mind couldn't grasp anything because the mind was completely quiet. The concepts had left. So then it's like, okay, how do I go back into the world? Literally, the next day I had to go back into being an attorney. And so then I think, well, I'm always going to live in this state of complete love and bliss that I'm feeling as these byproducts of this experience I had last night. Thinking, it must be these feelings that I'm having. This blissful feeling must be what awakening is. Not knowing that those two were temporary phenomena, and they were probably just arising because energy was shifting in my body through that awakening. And it's so easy. One of the pitfalls during it is to get really hooked in or identified with the blissful states that you feel. Because you think, you have this blissful or nice, warm, fuzzy, Shakti or whatever feeling in your body, and you think, this is it. And then, of course, over time, that either settles down or it rises and falls, but because it's in the world of form, it's not permanent. So when that starts to fall away and it starts to level out a little bit, if one of the pitfalls is I got to get that back. I need to get back that bliss back, because the bliss is the awakening. This simply being aware in the present moment is not awakening, because it's missing the bliss. And that's a trap, because almost all the teachings will tell you that bliss is a byproduct, or these feelings of warmth or whatever you feel are simply byproducts of it. The real awakening is when you recognize that you're not your mind, that you're not your thoughts, and that's just a movie happening here, and that what you really are is what's looking behind all that. And that's really what the awakening is. And then another thing that slips in right after for so many people is they begin to feel special, and I started to feel subtly special on a very low level at first. So, and you have to be super clear to like go around, especially if the awakening is new for you, and go around and give talks and where people come up to you and say these nice things or praise your teaching. You have to be super clear not to create some sort of ego out of that. And I did. The ego started to reform around some of that because I had come, again, from a lifelong story of feeling unlovable. And so when I had the awakening experience, a big chunk of that fell away, but there was that strand left of it, just that slight strand that was always in the background. And so when these people are coming to my meetings and they're saying, oh, you're so wonderful, and I love your book, and you're so clear, and you're doing, it's like, subtly, on some deep level, it's like, oh, it's feeding the deficiency story that's still there. And I didn't notice that for a while. And I kept wondering, why do teachers keep coming back to help people? What is it? Because if this is being driven by deficiency story, I don't want anything to do with it. I want to leave. Like if the reason teachers are coming to get followers, if the real reason is because they're still operating on deficiency stories, I want out of this game. So what I did instead is I started to question the deficiency story that made me attracted to that praise and to that projection that people were doing. And what I found is it was soothing the unlovable story. And so I had to get away from all of that and then inquire into the remaining aspects of this feeling of unlovability until it dissolved. And then when it dissolved, frankly, I lost interest in teaching. And it made me question about why other teachers are teaching. Because once I lost that feeling of that deep core story. It's like, I just don't care whether you like me or not. I just don't care whether you love me or not. I don't care whether you think I'm a good teacher or not. I mean, it's nice when you say nice things, but it's not affecting my being. My being is my being. My essence is my essence. It's not affected by whether you think I'm wonderful or whether you think I'm awful. And once I had that clarity, I had to start questioning where the motivation comes to teach. And so I left teaching for a number of reasons. That was one of them. Another reason was because of the way that the non-dual scene was set up. It was like the teacher sits in front of the room, and he's the authority or she's the authority, spouts a bunch of concepts. People believe the concepts. They keep coming back. And suddenly it's like it's almost like a new Christianity. It's like the new God is the guru. And it fell off to me in a world that is now evolving. We're evolving beyond these kinds of these patriarchal things where, the male figure is the all-knowing king or God or guru. It felt like an old structure. And especially since it was so male-dominated, and being gay, I could not identify either with male or female. So I saw the patriarchal part of it and how some of the men who were spiritual teachers were buying right into it as patriarchs and authorities. And then what I also saw is that the more that they would buy into the idea that they were authority, the more some of the people in the audience would just feel more deficient because they would have these projections towards these people who they thought were so perfect and enlightened and who often weren't even telling the truth about their actual experience. Teachers who weren't being transparent and telling the truth about what's really happened to them. That was solidifying the projection from all these seekers. And then they would come to me in private session, and then I have to deconstruct all that for them. It's like, why do you feel deficient? Well, because I'm not where Ramana is. Well, why do you think you're not where Ramana is? Well, because I'm not. It's a belief about self. So can we just look at that belief about self? Why do we have to focus on Ramana? Can we just look at this deficient self? Because if that's not there, if that's not real, Ramana is just going to be a guy from India. That's all it's going to be. A guy from India that helped a lot of people. but he's still just a guy from India. And that's where I think we're going, is once we inquire deeply into all these things, we're going to see that nobody gets to be special. That like, there is no special in this. Like, and that's where I'd like to see it go, because I think that's where we're all moving. The whole world is moving away from all these old structures that are hurting people. So coming back into teaching, I have to speak this way now, because the way I used to speak was being that guy that was silent, who wouldn't speak up in the face of these kinds of things, because I was too afraid of what backlash I would get from it. But now I've done enough inquiry to know that I can stand in my own truth, and I can say how I feel about all these things, and how I think that people are being harmed in some ways, misled in other ways, and that we're not telling the truth about our own experience yet, including the teachers. And they should be going first, in my opinion. I mean, the first is the teacher should say, here's what's really going on with me. I'm going to go first, because that's what creates a really safe space for people. Like if the teacher gets on the stage and doesn't go first and says a lot of fancy things leading you to think that they're a perfect being, then how safe do you feel to really be a human being in that room, right? Or how safe do you feel, or how even deficient do you feel in the face of someone that you've projected all that onto? So if we start pulling back those projections towards these people that we think are special, including me or whoever else it is, and we start turning towards what we're believing here, I feel like we can really make change on this earth, like big change. But the way we've been doing it doesn't seem to work. It seems to be, it's not going to work as we move forward. I feel that happening. It may take a while for things to change, but so many of these pitfalls come from the way I see the non-dual scene set up, the way it's been operating for decades. And so I feel like it's got to change for something new to come in, to change the way we see this whole teaching. And then there's the after pitfalls, and they're the most. So you have it. Some people say, wake up first, and then grow up. So in other words, have the awakening experience, and then fix all your shit after that. Other people say, purify, work on your stuff, and then as you're doing that, you're waking up and you're coming to the present. However what it is, there's different philosophies about it, but the point being is that what I did, again from my personal experience, was I bought into the idea that that there was some experience that I was going to have that was going to be very profound, that was going to wipe away all suffering. I heard the phrase cessation of suffering in Buddhism. And so I had a very profound experience. I had the most profound experience that I can't even put into words, but it was not the cessation of suffering completely. There were these things that remained for me, these little strands, okay? So I've yet to meet a human being, and maybe they're out there. I have to spend time with them to know whether they actually had one experience in which they've now experienced the total cessation of suffering. I hear stories of those people. I just not met one. Because when I'm in the room with people, especially teachers, if we can have an honest conversation, I find out what their experience is like, and it's more like my experience than it is like some fairy tale experience of complete cessation of suffering. But see, the idea of complete cessation of suffering, or the idea of a perfectly enlightened being, is something that sells. And that's the problem, is here we are in this capitalist system. So teachers are almost being forced to lie, or at least hide the truth of their actual life, of what goes on in their actual life. This is why you're seeing all the exposés and the scandals, because they're having to lie, because they're afraid that if they tell the truth, people won't come and listen to them anymore. But what I'm saying is that what if we just start telling the truth? What if teachers start telling the truth and the opposite happens? Is that we then realize, then we're just having a much more mature conversation then. that everybody gets triggered sometimes, and everybody's got stuff to work out, so we're just all working it out together without there being somebody we have to put on a pedestal as the new Jesus or whatever. So this is just my philosophy around this, you know. It's not like I'm trying to convince you all of this. I'm just saying that for me to be a part of this world, I have to be a part of it this way. You know, I don't want to be a part of it in the way that I was in the past, or the way that I see it happening with other people. And I still have things to look at. I know I do. One thing I've learned is that after the awakening, the moment that I think that I'm done is the most ignorant moment I'm having. The moment that I think that I'm there, because what is there? What does that mean? What is there? Because there's only here. And so what's arising now is the only relevant thing. It's not, that's it, you know? So the question comes up, am I ever done? You know, people ask, am I ever done? Or do I always have to keep looking at things? If you believe there can be a complete cessation of suffering, again, which I have not met a human being that I can say for sure. I've heard the stories, but I haven't met that human being. If you can have the complete cessation of suffering, then I guess you're done. I don't know. But for most of us, what you see is, my question I wrote down was, done with what? Because here we are again in the now, and things are either arising or they're not, and we're either looking at them or we're not. That's always what's going on. So done with what? If stuff's still arising, yeah, we're still here looking at it. And over time, less stuff arises. That's a good thing. Like, that's the beautiful thing about it, is that as you look more and more, less arises and you get quieter, you get triggered less. All of that's true. But why be concerned with done? Where does that come from? Done with living? Because life is going to give us a new trigger around every corner, or a new circumstance, or a new president that we don't like. So done with what? Because to me, this is an alive thing. It's like, it's not just resting completely in stillness while the world moves around me. I'm moving with the world. And I'm not done living in the world, even not just as awareness, but as an embodied human. You know, I want to live my life. And so one of the things that I really resonate with Ajahn is when he says, you have to become awake from your awakening. And the first time I heard that, I was like, I don't even really know what you mean by that, because I feel it, but it doesn't make sense. How do you become awake from your awakening? But what I understood is that, like, one of the pitfalls after when you start to realize things is that you can start to create a whole story, either a spiritual ego or just a fixation with awakening and talking about it and thinking about it, even afterwards. And so I found that I did that too. I mean, you're trying to help people, but at some point it becomes like a fixation. And at some point, you got to let go of it. You got to let go of all the talk so the only time I talk about non-duality is here. When I go home with Chester, we don't talk about that. You know, and that's the kind of life that I want to lead. I don't want to go spending the rest of my life just talking to everybody about non-duality. There's a lot of other interesting things on earth that I want to, but now I can go into the world in a less serious way with more tools to unhook myself from triggers and not get hooked up. So it's more fun to be in the world now. You see, I don't feel like I want to escape the world. I want to go further into it. And that's where I think this work can take you, is further into it, but awake in it. You know, and that's the difference. Like, you're awake while it's happening. You're awake to what's happening in front of you as you're living in the world. I just wrote down, you can't hide from the only world we know, even if it isn't an illusion. It just occurred to me, I was actually in the bathtub and I just had that thought. Like, you can't escape the world even if it is an illusion, because it's the only world that we have. So that's the middle way. Because it's like we start out maybe thinking that we want to escape the world or that there is no world. But then you find out there is, it just doesn't look the same way after awakening. But the world is still appearing. And it's the only one we have. So why wouldn't we be engaging in that world, even if it is an illusion? Because that's how we can make change on a bigger level. If we recognize the illusory nature of everything, of our politics and our religions and everything else, and then we re-engage in a completely different way from a place of clarity where we're not identified with all these roles and like nationalities, as Krishnamurti talks about, or religions, or even spiritual methods. We come in a completely different way towards everything, where we're not so stuck on identity anymore. One of the big things in politics that we can't get over is identity. Because it's like, I was talking to someone, it's like, can we just look at climate change, just the issue by itself, without having to look at it through the lens of whether you're a Republican or a Democrat in the United States? Like, can anybody look at the issue of healthcare without believing that you're a Democrat or a Republican? And it's such a hard thing for us to get over, this idea that this identity thing, we hold on to it. And I think it's really clouding our judgment and probably may even destroy the species if we're not careful in the end because of what we're doing. We're fighting over nothing but thoughts. And that's crazy. We should be waking up to that now. It's been enough, how many thousands of years? We should be recognizing that this is what's happening at this point. And we are. But the idea is to spread that message and to let people know. It's like you can keep fighting from different sides, different dualistic sides, black, white, gay, straight, Muslim, Christian. You can do that. Keep doing that. It hasn't worked throughout history. Why do you think it's going to work any longer? You've got all the evidence that you need to know that it hasn't worked. So now is the time to start questioning these things, these identities. And so one of the great things about after waking up is that it's really hard to identify with some of these things. But you have to be careful because they can sneak back in there and grab you, in certain ways. And that's one of the real reasons why I say that even after you wake up, whether you're a teacher or not, just keep looking for the benefit of all. Just keep looking, because if you don't, everybody else around you will know. You may not know that you're not looking at something, but everyone else around you will know. But if you keep looking, everyone else around you is going to know that too. And they're also going to be transformed by your own looking. And that's going to spread to other people. And then we may actually have a planet that wakes up at some point to itself. That's more than I wanted to say, actually. I was going to talk a little bit about just going through, I've gone through cancer and a serious spine condition after awakening. So if people think that I've been living in bliss for the last 6 years, they got another thing coming. What's really happened is that, here's the truth of my experience, is that in the last 10 years, I've spent a lot of time clearing the blockages that most people have in their body, for sure. I don't feel contraction through here, which is a really wonderful, clear, open, warm, fuzzy feeling, I'll be honest with you. But then I've got a really painful spine in the back that has really messed with my nervous system. So, it's something that I didn't predict happening, I thought I was just going to wake up and then never experience something like that, but that's ignorance because as we get older, stuff happens. But that's just life. That's the dirtiness of life. It's just like, I got a testicle removed because there was cancer in it. That's life. That's part of life too. And I think if we just stop dreaming that life is anything other than what's actually happening to us right now, to stop dreaming and stop seeing that life is exactly what's happening right now as it's happening, and we just allow it to happen as it happens, then we can get through anything. We can get through cancer, we can get through the death of loved ones, we can get through anything when we approach it that way, when we are actually meeting life in the moment with the feelings that are rising now, the thoughts that are rising now, I feel like, well, I know for sure that we can get through, because I've gone through the cancer, and I've gone through 2 years of a lot of pain, and even to the point of being, I'll tell you, suicidal at one point in the last year. I got to a place where the pain was so overwhelming, nerve energy was just streaming through my body at a level 11, and painkillers, because of the work that I've done, as I've told you, I can't tolerate. So when I went to the emergency room, there was nothing they could do for me. And I was literally crawling out of my skin, and just thoughts of like, just kill yourself, just kill yourself, just kill yourself, kill yourself. You don't have any other option. Nobody's helping you, just do it. So I called my doctor, and he calmed me down a little bit. But I mean, that's something that happened to me while being awake. You know, just that happens. That's the dirtiness of life. Now, the great thing is that once I noticed the suicidal thoughts were happening, I could just look at them. And I saw that what the brain was doing, it was just creating an option for me. It was like saying, it looks like you have no options, but you do. You have one option over here. You don't have to exercise it. So I just kept looking at that thought, and then, of course, that fell away. But that's the dirtiness of life. You know, it's like people thinking that, and of course, and there's also the beauty of all this, okay? I'm talking about the dirtiness, and I can't talk enough also about the beauty and the love and the intimacy and the transformation and the freedom, oh my God, the freedom that I've experienced in the last years after this. Didn't even know, had no idea that there could be this level of freedom on this earth. I thought it was all woo-woo. It's not. You can really be free. But at the same time, within that is the dirtiness of life. And so I think the thing, more than anything, that I've learned is that the non-dual awareness that we talk about, or the context, has to be merged with this appearance of form, this life. They have to be, literally there has to be a collapse between this awareness and this world, so that we wake up so much that we don't even see a division between awareness and life itself. And when that happens, when that last collapse happens, and you're no longer even identifying with awareness, that's when you can go back into the world in the middle way. You know, because I'm in the world as Scott Kiloby. I'm not in the world as non-dual awareness. See, I call it the Kiloby Center. I don't call it non-dual awareness. So, and I love that. I love the way that we can play in the world now after doing all this work without taking even cancer as seriously, or taking a year of pain so seriously. Like, there's so many wonderful things that happen, but there's also so many dark places that people go on this path. So it's worth talking about. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. Let's go.